We spend a lot of time talking to our computers and other gadgets nowadays. Siri, Alexa, and Cortana are starting to feel like a part of everyone's family. The rise of these voice interactions has created a whole new field that content strategists and other interaction designers need to understand. In this episode, I talk with Phillip Hunter. Phillip has been creating these conversational interactions for 20 years. We talk a bit about the history of voice technology, and then we dive right into the details of designing and implementing modern voice systems.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. We talk with professionals who work across the span of content strategy, from small businesses to big enterprises, from content design to content marketing, from solo consultancies to huge agencies. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 48 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I'm really happy today to have with us Phillip Hunter. Phillip is currently a senior principal at 24/7, which is one of those companies that kind of helps people with customer experience across the board,
That's
right?
Yeah.
And before that, you were at AWS and Alexa at Amazon, and before that, you were with. You also had been. After that, you were with Pulse Labs.
Pulse Labs, started.
Right. Well, so tell me a little bit more about how does one. So we're in the midst of this crazy new conversational era with Alexa and Siri all over the place.
Right.
And you're one of the people who built it. So tell me a little bit about your background, how you got here, and how this whole crazy thing.
Sure. So first of all, thanks a lot for having me. It's a lot of fun to participate in this, and it's a lot of fun to talk about where things are and talk about talking as an interface, as a next generation of where computing is going and user interface and user experience. And there's a lot of exciting things to think about. There's a lot of misconceptions out there too, so we can touch on that. So I'm at 24/7, which is in the customer experience contact center space, primarily building systems that help people with customer service inquiries, whether they want to call over the phone or they use a chat bot or they connect directly to a human through a phone or through a chat interface online. And it's a field I've been in and out of over my career. I started as a developer building touch-tone applications, the button pressing ones, way back in the early 90s. And my career trajectory into both UX and design and voice happened about the same time in the late 90s. I discovered that I actually really hate developing. I understand it, and I appreciate how much of a skill it is to be a great developer, but I really don't like doing that part. Because a lot of it is because I tend to think about the problem at a higher level that's being solved, not the immediate code problem or the technology problem. I think about the human problem, and now I'm at 24/7. I get to focus on both how the company is embracing and moving into this conversational age, and so how design gets done in that realm. But I'm also looking. I also work at a more strategic level around different programs that we have going on to help customers, help clients get the most out of our services. And so I spend a lot of time with data, I spend a lot of time with technical teams, understanding how we make certain things happen for the customer experience. And I've got a background over the past few years in moving into more product management type activities as well. And so I tend to put several hats on when I go to work in the morning, and which I enjoy. I was at a startup, Pulse Labs, like you mentioned before, and as VP of product. And one of the things that I enjoy about startup, and this is my fourth time doing that, is just the ability to work on what's needed that day, whether it's the product or solving a personnel problem or designing the future or whatever. So it's just it's a lot of fun to be able to move between things. So history, that's kind of where I'm at. How do we get here? So, I don't want to get too esoteric or philosophical, but the one of the quests of computing has always been to mimic the human brain to some extent, right? So even the calculation machines and the engines, and going all the way back to the very beginnings where computers were more mechanical than digital. You see people reaching for how do we mimic the human brain, and how do we mimic the things that we can do as humans, and then of course we quickly learned that we could do that at certain levels, and then we could do it more powerfully. So now we can, our computers do amazing things that mentally, intellectually, we are capable of creating and making it happen, but we could never do that processing on our own. None of us could, we can't archive 1 billion objects in our head and find them, in milliseconds, or find one in particular in milliseconds. So voice has been very much a part of that since, for decades and decades now. The research on recognizing voice and synthesizing voice goes back to the 50s and the 60s with Bell Labs and other research facilities around the world. And for a long time, like many other parts of computing, this was a very intensive task that took large computers at the time to process. And so you had a room full of processors that were, just trying to decode a few seconds worth of speech and things like that. And it wasn't until several things started coming together in the late 80s and 90s around processor power was increasingly coming in a smaller package. Storage was being condensed as well. So you had this whole miniaturization effect that was going on through the 80s and 90s. And at some point, there was a convergence where the amount of voice processing that could happen on a relatively small, a PC-sized computer was acceptable enough to do commercial applications. And so that's when it finally moved out of the lab and out of theory into practice. And so in the mid-90s, you had several startups that were focused on this. And you had some products that were like Dragon systems, naturally speaking, where your computer could do speech recognition for you. But that was a very different thing than a widespread multi-user commercial application. And so in the mid-90s, you started seeing these startups taking advantage of this convergence, and which is the startup story, right? Whenever multiple things collide or intersect, all of a sudden you have new opportunity. And so you had several startups who said, "Hey, let's build processing packages that'll run on a PC, and that will, and then we can connect other PC enterprise grade applications to that," which started as is obvious in hindsight in the customer service space, where there were already billions of phone calls a year going into companies, into your bank, your airlines, your insurance company, whatever, and they wanted to be able to automate some of those, which was done poorly in touchtone, and so we started to move over to speech recognition. Now, that it became pretty ubiquitous, and the technology has stayed actually at a fairly level level plateau since the late 90s in terms of what it's capable of. There have been moderate gains, but we haven't yet hit really the next inflection point.
That's interesting, though, to me, because that's about when the internet comes along.
Yes,
so
right.
does that then become the mechanism by which things kind of throwing fuel on that fire.
Yeah. So to go back to the theme of intersecting technological advances, the internet comes along, and one of the first things that started getting explored were software as a service, or what we now call the cloud. So you are able to use an application, but the application is being served somewhere else, and you might have you might have an interface to it right on your desktop, but you're not installing anything. You're using it, from somewhere else, and so that was so one big thing that started happening there, and then of course that's AWS was born out of that in 2007. It was happening already, but AWS really made a business out of it. The other thing that started happening was just being able to, because applications were being centralized as a service. Now you had the capability to collect massive amounts of data in one location. And for speech recognition, that's really crucial. It's something we call a non-deterministic technology, which means that at any given moment, the processing is taking a best guess about what's happening. And if you're familiar with machine learning, that's essentially what machine learning is doing too. It's a very, very sophisticated pattern matching system. And the speech recognition technology is essentially trying to match patterns with the audio signal that it detects, and then with past patterns it has stored and amalgamated over time. And so machine learning then, as it developed, became a second very powerful thing here as well, because the more data that we can collect and throw at things like speech recognition, the better we can get at it. Now, there's still a noticeable gap between a speech processor and a human, and people might chuckle at that when they hear me say that. The interesting thing is,
no, but you know it when you see it.
Well,
when a machine makes some obvious machine level.
Well, that's what I'm saying. The chuckle might be because some people will say, "No, there's a huge gap, Philip. What are you talking about? There's just a noticeable gap."
Yeah.
And you're not wrong, but if you think that. But the interesting thing is so there's a lot of terminology that gets thrown around, but on a pure accuracy standpoint, machines are about as performant as humans, meaning there are just a few percentage points that distinguish the machine and us. Now, the thing is, though, there's so much more than pure recognition that goes into being able to process language.
Right, that's what I want to get. It's like, how do you, so you've got that, you've got something that can pretty much hear the same as you. Is it listening as well?
Right. Yeah.
And can it craft a conversation on the fly? That's kind of...
Well, and it's, and we're nowhere near some of those things. That's the reality, is that we, the level of sophistication we have with speech recognition now is astonishing compared to when I started 20 years ago. But it doesn't mean it's anywhere near human capabilities. And so there's various characterizations of it. You might hear as like a 4-year-old who has memorized the encyclopedia, or a 4-year-old who knows how to use the internet. And so what's being got at there is that 4-year-olds have a very limited amount of domain knowledge. They're still in rapid learning mode. I would say, though, that the average 4-year-old is still learning much faster than any of our machine learning processors. And there's various reasons for that. Some commercial, some technological. But where we are today is a factor of the internet coming along, high-speed bandwidth, making it possible to take high-quality recordings out of an Alexa or any other speech recognition device, pass them up to the processors in the cloud very quickly, do that processing, and ship it right back down. And so where things have gotten a lot better are processing speed, coverage of basic things, cross-context, multi-context. So when I was first doing this, we were deploying applications within a very narrow context. And if you said anything outside of that context, it would either bring about a false positive where it would think you said something that you didn't say because it was trying really hard to make a match, or it would just reject it and say, I don't understand you. And you can still see these things happen, with Alexa and Google Assistant. You can say things to them that are so, particular to you or particular to your context that it's just not going to get it. But at the same time, you can ask about everything from what movies are out right now to, facts and figures that you might find on Wikipedia. So this, fairly broad range of coverage, but it's the putting it all together.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious, because I get that. So it gets the vocabulary, and it's like this really precocious 4-year-old learn like crazy.
Yeah.
And putting it all together. But going from that to a coherent kind of adult level conversation.
Right.
What's the secret sauce, the magic that's happening there?
Yeah, so...
Because we do it all the time.
Yeah, and as you said, as we were talking a little bit earlier, sharing language with each other is our first sophisticated interface. Now, of course, our ancestors were drawing figures and gesturing and making noises. But once once particular sounds started being associated with one or more particular meanings, then we had a tool that enabled us to do everything that we've done in humanity up to this point, right? There's nothing that has gotten done without language. If we had no language, we'd still be communicating by bopping each other on the head or grunting or things like that. Yeah. Which is still a form of language, but it's not the sophistication, that we would need to accomplish what we've done as people. And so where we're trying to get to in that technology is just start to do that at a very basic level. And that a lot of that is very manual work right now.
That's right. I've heard many conversations and things I've read about what percentage of these virtual or these online interactions are actually AI machine learning driven, things that just the machine is doing versus
right.
human augmented stuff.
Yeah.
It's a pretty high percentage of still being humanly augmented.
Definitely augmented. Now, that doesn't mean that a human is actively listening in and doing something during the course of your particular interaction, but there are a number of pieces. So, for example, there's in the news, there's been, Alexa's listening and Amazon has your recordings. Well, that's always been true. And it has to have been true for us to do this work at all. We have to take the audio signals and say, and just actually do a verification. It's a very simple verification. Someone listens to the audio, they write down the words that are in it, and then we match that against what the machine thought those words were. So you do a text-on-text matching, and you basically form a judgment about was it right or was it wrong, and then what's the delta between those.
So it's that simple.
Oh, yeah.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. And then from there, now data scientists will use, there's sophisticated tagging mechanisms that we use to understand, if it was different, if the machine got it wrong, what was the difference and what should we be learning from it? But those have to be used in order to feed back into the machine learning. Now, this is true in any machine learning. You and I were at the recent Ignite, and there was a talk about using machine learning to detect a cat approaching a cat window. Well, he used the same exact process. He took a bunch of pictures, or he had his setup take a bunch of pictures, and then he went through and analyzed which ones did the algorithm properly understand as a cat approaching the cat window, and which ones were false positives, or in some case false negatives, where the cat was approaching but it didn't detect it. Now, and so it's the same thing. It's and without getting into the ethical concerns, of which there are many, the raw process depends on that audio signal being translated or transcribed into text, and then compared to what the machine did, and just tell the machine you were right or you were wrong, and depending on what it is, seeing how can you do better next time.
Right. And so the kind of the flip side of that is what would be of most interest to my content strategy peeps is that, so how do you then like harvest that, or kind of tag, like you were talking about tagging it, I assume there's other kind of taxonomic things you're doing to kind of clump it together and make it into useful things. That turnaround, I think when I was talking to you at Ignite, you used the term just-in-time content.
Right.
And I was like, bing, that's what we're talking about here. Is like, that's what a conversation entails.
Yeah.
So tell me how that, the other side of that, like with the content in your answer, where does that come from?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different things going on there. Now, with when we used to do these very narrow context applications, they were static, and we would primarily, now we would have some dynamic. We could read a piece of data or a set of data, excuse me, and know that we would extract certain values from that and plop it into a construct we had already defined. So reading your bank balance, you have an available balance of $162.48. So that, the value is dynamic, but the context is very static. Now that doesn't, so what we do now though, and what we're able to do with things like Google Assistant, Alexa, and Cortana is start to mimic a much more dynamic set of information. The reality is that it's not all, there are a lot of constructs that are pre-built before anyone ever interacts with it. So it's not, the machine is not making it up on the fly, but it is in some cases, pulling things that it doesn't have in memory. So for example, Alexa will do a Wikipedia search for you. Now, they have an algorithm to pull some fairly small set of information from Wikipedia and give that to you. It's not going to read you a 5-page Wikipedia, multi-section Wikipedia article. It's just going to give you a paragraph or two. And that's useful. And there is certainly a content strategy around that, of course, right? So to say, what are we going to pull and how much of it will we read and things like that. But it doesn't rise to the level of sophistication of really directly answering a question. So, for example, we play around at home sometimes with just asking questions. My partner worked at Alexa as well, and so we have several devices, and we'll just every once in a while see how it's doing. And we'll ask things like, I think one time we were, before the last Avengers movie came out, and everybody's predicting blockbuster, and we were wondering, okay, well, what are the records? What are the top grossing films of all time? And so we just kept asking all of these different questions, and it was really interesting. It would technically get the answers right, but it wasn't engaged in the conversation.
This is interesting. So you're kind of learning how to structure queries that get, or like, could you get like, if I ask it this way, it'll return me a 10-item list or something like that. Or,
and that's a fascinating tangent, because there are hypotheses out there that the machines are teaching us to talk like them, as if the machines have some sort of actor ability. Yes, they are actors in the sense of they carry out motions and commands and things, but the machines don't have a will, right? We can debate that offline, but the machines don't have a will to make us talk like them. what's happening is for all of us UX oriented people, it's the way the machines are designed, the way the automated systems are designed. They're not designed to allow human or enable really human conversation. So if you and I were having a discussion about top grossing films, we would probably also get into which ones we liked and which ones we thought were better movies than others, and which ones should have done well or should have done better than others. We would just sort of jump around in that area. And if you happen to be a movie buff, or somebody who memorizes a lot of entertainment statistics, then you might be able to roll off a few things. But you're not. If I said, do you know that Avatar is still the number one grossing movie? You might say, oh, I didn't even know that would be the top one. I would have thought it was such and such or something. And that's a very meaningful conversation for us. And we might touch on all the same facts that you would with Alexa, but we don't. But we don't just stay there, right? And this is, to go back to your question about, where do we really need to go? Part of what we don't have yet in this technology is a deep appreciation and understanding for what conversation really is. We're using this term conversational, whether it's chatbot or Alexa or a system that you call over the telephone.
Exactly. Yeah.
We're using that term conversational simply because there's an exchange of words and sentences. But conversation is so much richer than that. There's several things that we aren't yet doing to really approach that richness. One of them is that variability, and the fact that a conversation really can float between various contexts, and we're really, really good at managing that in our heads. We don't even think about it, right? Conversations, if we had to stop and think every time we were going to say more than 5 words, I mean really think, not just, I don't mean thoughtless speech, but I mean really think, all of our interactions would grind to a halt. We just,
well, that gets at just by coincidence, when I ran into you at Ignite, I was reading Erica Hall's book on conversational design. And she talks in there, she kind of goes back to how human conversation was, kind of what we can do now, and how you can't just mimic how people, like you're saying, that's not going to be possible anytime soon. So you kind of have to do it in a way that makes sense in the medium and in the interaction. And that gets that's a whole other conversation about the design of this whole...
And that's what I'm getting to, is that there are conversational structures and tools. We don't tend to think of... Because we talk so naturally, those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to do so, talk and listen so naturally, we don't typically stop and think that there are many, many tools and practices and other things that we are doing as we are talking and listening that are fairly well structured. And there's some fantastic books out there on mechanical and conceptual conversational analysis, and how we construct and box up and process meaning. And how do we, so everything from word choice to how do we tell that the other person is in sync with us? What mechanism do I have to...
And now I'm thinking about that truism that 90% of human conversation and understanding is nonverbal. And then it's...
Well, and it's a funny thing. So I'm familiar with a number of those truisms around that. They're all, like most truisms, they're all true enough to be useful. The statistics don't really matter. A lot of the things that we do with gesture and facial expressions are about the signal we're giving each other. Are we in sync? So there's some concepts around the collaborative nature of and cooperative nature of conversation. You and I have to negotiate fairly constantly while we're talking. In other words, if I, in the middle of this, started talking about even something, relevant like the Women's World Cup or the, recent spate of Supreme Court decisions, you would know what I'm talking about, but you would not prefer that I go down that direction, and you would use, even without knowing, you might use some visual mechanisms to indicate, like, what are we doing here? I thought we were on this other topic. And I would, being a fairly sensitive enough person, I would pick up on those and say, oh, wait, Larry is indicating that he is not in sync with where I'm taking this conversation anymore. I better check in with him. And we do that pretty often. We explain something to someone, and if we're looking at them, or if you can see them somehow, and they get a look on their face, and then you're like, oh, well, so was it what I just said clear, or do you want me to try to say it a different way? And they didn't say anything to that effect, but it's a very rich communication that they've given us to say, they're saying, I might need a little help following where you just went.
Well, I'm wondering now, too, you've got me thinking about some of the online interactions I've had where can you sort of build in like checkpoints or something like that? Like, hey, we on track here?
And that is, that's one of the things that I think we're not using very well. And honestly, it's really complex because there's a level of very implicit trust and understanding we have when we're talking to another person that we are not able yet to give to a machine because we don't know. And the number one problem I see is hesitancy among people who are using these devices because they don't know what to expect. And when we don't have a way to predict something reasonably, then we get very hesitant. It's human nature, and you can know this feeling anytime you do something new for the first time. If you pick up a musical instrument you've never played, or if you maybe work with, if you like to cook and you start to work with a food or a set of ingredients that you've never worked with before, or maybe you get a new tool for your woodworking shop. There's this time period where we say all kinds of things. I'm getting used to it, or I'm still picking it up, or, I'll come up to speed soon. And all of those have to do with not just your level of comfort using it, but it's also the ability to predict what will happen when you do use it, or when you do try to engage that. And when we are talking to a machine right now, we don't have a level of predictability that we're comfortable with for general conversation. Now, once we, you can learn, and this is why, with Alexa, the stats are through the roof on music and weather and news and other stuff that has been predictable for a long time, right? And those are sort of table stakes. But if it's trying to, you wouldn't say, Alexa, give me a synopsis and analysis of the current Washington D.C. political situation, but you might have a good friend where you would say that sort of sentence and be able to learn and things. But Alexa there's a number of layers there that Alexa and any other assistant is not capable of, and so. Saying that kind of thing to Alexa, you're actually more predicting that some sort of hilarity will ensue because it'll just not know what to do with it. But if you said that to a good friend, that you trusted there, you would expect that person to come back with, well, here's what I think is going on. And you would be very comfortable waiting for that answer and accepting of that. And so that level of predictability and the ability to correct, the ability to do those check-ins, and really it gets down to this ability to have a predictable, cooperative conversation that we're so used to with other human beings that's really the next step is when will our machines be able to do that in a way that feels good to us? Right,
and it won't necessarily be mimicking like what we're doing right now. It'll be something appropriate for this new medium.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll, thinking about it from the analogy of the child again, it's not too far from that in terms of, if you're a parent, you've spent a certain amount of time around children of different ages, you start to get used to tailoring your interaction with them according to what you think they're capable of. And so, you talk to a 3-year-old very differently than you would talk to a 10-year-old, very differently than you talk to a 16-year-old, differently than you talk to a college age, kid. And this goes back to those expectations. You expect, that a kid at 16 has been through a certain amount of school, has been through a certain amount of life experiences, has been is capable of a higher order level of thought that is more symbolic and logical versus super concrete, but we can't yet put those projections on the machine, right? 'Cause, in fact, we know that they don't have lived and learned experiences similar to a human. So we right off the bat, there's just this big X through a set of things that we usually depend on knowing, and we don't have anything to replace it with.
Right.
No matter what.
Well, again, you're kind of reminding me of I think an attempt to replace that is the notion of personalization, like to have an awareness of demographics like age and context and stuff like that, and then to personalize the conversation or the content based on that. Is that...
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, yeah, there's a certain set of things it is in the sense that if there is a team behind that, then they can structure a fairly large set of interactions that could go along with things that are personalized to you. But stepping outside of that, so I mean, I'm going to make up a silly example. Now I've got college kids on my mind. Cold pizza. So many of us grew up, we were in college and we got used to the idea of like cold pizza the next morning. Maybe it was on the floor, maybe it was in the fridge. Who knows? It doesn't really matter. We ate it, right? Because we were stupid and we were in college. Some of us still have a taste for cold pizza, but most of us as adults prefer, certain types of meals hot. Now, one of the things that we think about when someone really gets to know us is how well do they know these little bitty things about us, like our tiny little preferences, that there's no database on earth that is necessarily going to register these sorts of things because they don't show up in our buying behavior or our browsing behavior. In other words, we're not looking up 10 best ways to serve cold pizza, and so, now we might get some pizza recipes or we might get a bunch of offers for delivery or things like that from that, but there's no algorithm out there that's going to pick that up and say, well, Larry's one of those interesting people that never grew out of that taste for cold pizza from college. And that's why I like him so much, doggone it. And so, there's personalization in the sense of we can know a bunch of facts about you that are super contextual, and we can put those together in some useful ways to make your browsing experience better, your shopping faster, or even just do things like, remind you that it's, your significant other's birthday coming up, and by the way, here are the 10 things they asked for, that you didn't know they wanted. Sure, but there's a huge difference between that and seeing that old friend that you haven't seen in 20 years who says, hey, I remember that you used to really like to put, ketchup on your cold pizza in the morning. Do you still do anything crazy like that? You're like, oh, that's so funny.
Right. And that's the kind of thing that would be really creepy if you're...
Oh, absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, Philip, we're coming up on time.
Sure.
I always like, before I wrap up, to give my guests an opportunity. Is there anything last? Anything that hasn't come up or that's just on your mind, or about, conversational design or chatbots or voice interfaces? Anything that we haven't got to yet?
Well, there's so much to say, and I we could go on and on a number of topics. I think, one of the biggest things that I think about a lot is the fact that language is a tool. It's an interface. It's a set of affordances. Even it's language as an affordance is a concept that I think about when. Both for people who are practicing this now and for people who want to get into this field, like what do they need to think about? So one of the biggest problems that we introduce as technologists is to use language as just a system-centered form-filling vehicle. In other words, just making the human answer a bunch of questions or memorize a bunch of commands. And we've gotten used to these things through mobile, through the web, through the ubiquity of computing devices now. Most of us carry one around, and we work on one or two or three, and we have multiple devices now in our homes and our cars that require some sort of computational interaction. But but language transcends all that, right? And when we think about the things that we use for UX on our laptops or web or mobile, we are taking a very, very small slice of the language capabilities and narrowing them way, 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 way down for those contexts. So if you look at even the most sophisticated interface, let's say for enterprise applications, you've really still got this boiled down to, like, there's some things I can move around on the screen. There's some things I can click, which is a metaphor. We're not pushing any physical buttons. There's a list chooser options. There are text entry. These things it's a fraction of the things that we use language for. And so one of the biggest ways I can encourage people who want to get into this field to start opening their mind to this is start to study language, start to study how people interact using language, because that's where it's got to go. This is not about making it easier for computers to understand us. It's about making computers work harder to facilitate the things that we already do really, really well. So I put in a little plug, if that's okay. Otherwise, you can cut it out.
No, go ahead.
I'm an associate of mine, and I are starting a new conference called Points Made, and it's about addressing these sorts of issues in the conversational space. Like, what would it really mean if a computer could support things that really felt conversational? And a lot of that hinges on the natural evolution of language that's occurred over thousands and thousands of years, which we're still decoding, by the way. Even just to understand it between two people, it's still fascinating, and there's new literature on topics that is very significant, and so I would say, start there. Don't think about how do I turn a mobile site into a voice application. Start to think about how would two people talk about that.
And that's what the Points Made conference will be all about.
Yeah, really.
Have you planned the first one yet? Is this
we actually, today's our launch day, serendipitously.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so we just launched the website.
Well, send me a link. I'll make sure we put it in the show notes.
Oh, awesome. I appreciate that. Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, I should wrap up here. Well, thanks so much. This has been a great conversation.
I really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you, Larry.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.